Oscar, this is Sienna. I will inquire. Over.
From the maritime safety, they're wondering if you feel able to hold in the area of the stand aside here in case persons need to take into a life raft or abandon the ship, abandon the boat prior to the rescue. Over.
ABC helicopter, this is Sienna. I will inquire. However, we are not that manoeuvrable. We're under very small sails. The sea is very rough down here, although we do have our engine on. I'll be back to you in a moment. Over.
ABC chopper, roger, waiting, and ABC chopper to stand aside. Over.
It was December 26, 1998, or Boxing Day. The conditions were favorable. 20 to 25 knot northeasterly winds and a 4 knot current pushing the boats pleasantly towards Hobart. The crew of the Winston Churchill were buzzing with excitement. The Winston Churchill was one of the most experienced crews in the entire race, with roughly 60 Sydney to Hobart races combined. The Winston Churchill was a 51-foot wooden vessel that had completed a number of offshore races in its time, including 18 other Hobart races, with the inaugural race in 1945. If any vessel would be able to handle the intense conditions, the crew was certain it would be the Winston Churchill. This year, the crew consisted of 9 experienced sailors. Almost all had sailed before and knew each other well from being around the Cruising Yacht Club of Australia. The least experienced sailor, 19-year-old Michael Rynan, still had been sailing for a great majority of his life. The first few hours were smooth sailing, but at around 1 p.m. on Boxing Day, race officials issued a storm warning for just south of Australia. The low-pressure system was not something that was new to the race, as for the past 5 years there had been similar storm warnings, and most boats had escaped those without a scratch. Even the National Weather Service could not predict the deadly conditions brewing in the Bass Strait. For a while, the crew was handling the worsening conditions with ease, surfing the building waves with almost no sail, a technique used by sailors to ensure the vessel isn't overpowered by using only a small part of the sail to deal with the high winds. The crew was still flying through the water. That's when they were hit with a rogue wave at roughly 3:30 p.m. on the 27th. The wave towered over the boat as she began to climb, and she was quickly thrown off course, making it almost impossible to steer against the wave. Rolling the boat onto its side, the crew who were off watch and trying to sleep were thrown up into the roof, slamming against each other and equipment inside the boat. Quote, "All of a sudden I got thrown into the roof, into the kitchen, and I woke up, being hit in the head. And there was all this water in the boat, and water just kept coming in," end quote. 55-year-old Bruce Gold said, quote, "I'd been helming the boat for over a half an hour and went below when Richard Winning took over. I was laying on a sail and then there was an almighty crash. I was thrown across the cabin and I dislocated my thumb," end quote. The crew on deck, consisting of Winning and Dean, were soaked, shaken, and tangled in the backstay and lifelines. The wave had washed over the top of the deck, flooding the underbelly of the boat below, taking Winning and Dean overboard briefly before they got back on with their harnesses still intact. This particular wave broke green water over the deck and completely knocked the vessel down. Both John, Dean, and I were swept overboard, but saved by our harnesses, Winning said. Due to the force of the wave, the Winston Churchill sustained some severe damage to the underbelly of the boat where the hull curves to the keel. This damage caused a leak that led to the Winston Churchill's cabin to begin to fill with water at a rate that the bilge pumps could not keep up with. The electronic instruments on the boat were completely waterlogged, and the paper charts they were keeping were essentially mush. Stanley and Winning tried to start up the motor to no avail. The crew began to highly consider abandoning ship. Then, Winning issued a mayday call on VHF radio, which was acknowledged. A search and rescue crew was notified, however, the Australian Maritime Command were flooded with other mayday calls in very difficult and intense rescue conditions, so the response time would be longer than usual. He provided an approximate location of the vessel, and the crew began to prepare to abandon ship in 2 small life rafts. It was starting to grow darker and darker, with no rescue in sight on the 27th. The rafts had been originally tied together, but due to the intense conditions, they were quickly separated. The rafts began to drift rapidly. The 4-person raft with crew Rynan, Winning, Gold, and Paul Lutman. The 6-person raft was filled with the remaining 5 crew: Stanley, Gibson, Lawler, Bannister, and Dean. The 4-person crew would experience 2 complete rolls over the next 25 hours before their eventual rescue at 5 p.m. on the 28th. The 5 others would experience much worse. The 5 men in the larger raft began to experience intense rolls and tossing around every so often. The raft was surfing the huge waves alone. One particularly intense wave sent the raft flying through the water upside down. Inside the raft, they were sitting in water that made it so there was about 18 inches of air left trapped inside by the floor of the life raft, which was now the top. Bannister offered to climb out of the raft to try and right it. But because of the water now inside of the raft, he would have to take off his life jacket, meaning if he were to get pushed over by another large swell, he wouldn't be brought back. The crew decided against it. It was too dangerous for Bannister or anyone to try and brave the elements to right the raft. They came up with the decision to cut a small 4-inch incision in the floor, now the top of the raft, to let air in. Gibson heard the all too familiar and terrifying sound of water rushing around them. The wave began to break right over the raft and sent them tumbling down, rolling the raft back into its upright position. Then he heard a loud rip come from underneath them. Gibson decided with his harness he would clip himself into the tube of the raft and hope that it would be enough to keep him within the safety of the ring. The men were holding onto the outer tube of the raft and bits of the now shredded canopy. The storm was raging on despite the struggle for survival below. At around 2 a.m., Gibson was thrown from an almost sleep-like state into the white water of a wave. Struggling to hold on to the safety line he had tied himself earlier in the night, when he got back to the raft, he heard Stanley calling out, "Is everyone all right?" Stanley would only receive one response. Gibson and Stanley began to scan the darkness for any signs of their missing friends. They saw them hundreds of meters away, being swept up in the towering waves. Quote, "I remember John Stanley saying, 'Gibbo, there's nothing we can do for the boys. The raft is moving,'" Gibson said. Stanley was right. The raft was being picked up and tossed around farther and farther from their lost crew members. The 2 remaining men still had 18 hours at sea ahead of them before they would be winched to the safety of a rescue helicopter. When the men were finally spotted by a rescue helicopter, Gibson was the first to be winched to safety. The rescuers were not able to jump down and help the men because of how intense the conditions were, so they lowered down a harness and had Gibson and Stanley climb into it themselves. Gibson was winched up to safety without an issue. Stanley, however, began his journey to the helicopter up when he realized he was tangled in the raft, which was also being pulled upwards with him. Stanley jumped back into the water to try and untangle himself, and eventually he was able to get into the helicopter and taken back to safety at around 8 p.m. on December 28th, nearly 30 hours after the Mayday call was made.